I'm sorry about the heat, even though there's nothing I can do about it, and I didn't make it this way, but soon there'll be more heat when you start hearing about the Aztecs, right?
Yeah, we hope you stay awake.
My name is Winifred Sullivan. I'm the chair of the IU Department of Religious Studies, and this is the third lecture in our fall lecture series. So before I introduce our speaker, let me mention the fourth and final lecture, which will be on December 3rd in this room at 5:30. And the speaker is Alessandro Ferrari, who's professor of law at the University of Como in Italy, and he will speak on religious freedom on the two sides of the Mediterranean. So, our speaker this afternoon is Kay Reed, Professor Emeritus at DePaul University in Chicago. Professor Reed holds a Master in Art Education from the University of Illinois and a PhD in History of Religions from the University of Chicago. She is the author, in addition to many articles, of Time and Sacrifice in the Aztec Cosmos, and most recently of Mesoamerican Mythology, a Guide to the Gods, Heroes, Rituals, and Beliefs of Mexico and Central America. And the lecture you're hearing tonight is part of the work on a new book in which she brings together her interests both in ecology and environmental ethics on the one hand and on Aztec mythology. I think for many of us who don't know much about the Aztecs, this seems like an odd juxtaposition. I think you'll find when you begin to listen to Kay that they're really intimately connected in ways that are really remarkable. She's also a member of the Institute of Nature and Culture at DePaul University. So just on a personal note, Kay and I met, I think about 10 years ago, at the retirement party for our PhD dissertation supervisor. So we actually did our dissertations at different times, and we wouldn't have known each other otherwise. Then we were each asked to speak at Frank's retirement. And so although we work on very different fields, we hit it off. And one of the first things we did is we coached each other through a book project. And for those of you who have done that, this is something that's really valuable. We met weekly. I knew nothing about Aztec mythology. She knew very little about the kind of legal work that I did, but we talked each other through this and kept each other honest, I guess we'd say. And we actually, both books got written, and we became friends. So I'm really delighted that she's here. So her title today is, as you see, Cooking the Cosmos, Ecologically Understanding the Aztecs and Ourselves. Welcome, Kay. Let me cap this up before I do something drastic with it. Spill it. Why don't you cap it up? Okay. First of all, I want to thank the Religious Studies Department for inviting me to this. This is wonderful. Winnie for working with me on this, and it's nice to see old faces that date back to grad school days as well. Actually before, although I didn't know you then. And students from Winnie's class are here, and I really had a ball in this class. I thought it went really well. And I told Winnie I was impressed with you guys. You guys are doing well, you're smart, and therefore you're fun. Okay, so today I'm going to focus on imagery of pots in order to explore the role of cooking, feeding and eating, birthing and warring, and right, sacrificial, ecologically rooted relationships. The pot imagery of both bowls and cooking vessels comes from 18 folios in the Codex Borgia, a pictorial document from the Mexican highlands created sometime before the Spanish conquest in 1521. Elizabeth Hill Boone has argued persuasively that these 18 pages tell a cosmogonic tale whose verbal presentation is partly, but not totally, lost to us. The rest of the Borgia's 58 pages represent a fairly standard divination manual used by Nahuatl, or Aztec speakers. I'm focusing on these pots because I want to use Nahuatl cosmological culinary ideas as a skeletal outline for constructing what I am calling a Nahuatl ecological ontology. Does everybody know what ontology means? Do we we need to define this? No? Okay, we're good. Just checking. All right. Who's doing the clicking? Whoops, whoops, whoops. Abby? Here, he's going to click. You can do just fine with it. Yeah, see, he knows how to click. Why? Because when he says it sounds strange. Okay, so I have to explain myself. Why? Because these Nawa cosmological ideas, I'm fairly convinced, can serve as a non-Western comparison to stimulate ecologically grounded ontological ideas of our own, and because such comparisons can prove fertile ground for growing ideas to think with, which could nurture us with some new recipes, but also perhaps poison us if we do not pay them good attention. We begin with 3 curiously potted images here. Okay, click. I think it's better just to hit it. There you go. On the first folio of the cosmogony, wind beings pour from a dark bubbling mixture brewing in an anthropomorphized pot. This pot wears a skull-like face and looks like a seated rump. Its legs and arms ending in clawed feet and hands. Sacrificial banners decorate the bubbling writhing stew, while a skeletal goddess with clawed appendages hovers above, perhaps birthing, pooping, or simply overseeing this nighttime underworld cooking project. And so was the Nawa cosmos' beginning, literally cooked up. Okay. 3 pages further, we are presented by another deity, sitting in a similarly anthropomorphized pot. This time the deity is surrounded by the same underworld dark substance, but instead of a skeletal figure brewing wind snakes, we've been there, done that, this forward-facing goddess is birthing 2 major gods, Quetzalcoatl, or feathered serpent, from her heart cavity, and from her head, his twin brother, Tezcatlipoca, or smoking mirror. Both play critical roles in what is to come. Like her pot, Mama is painted as a sacrificial being. Indeed, like her watery house in which she resides, she's made of sacrificial knives. 1 knife marks her heart cavity, 2 form her face and head, and 4 mark her joints. Moreover, around her, warriors float in the night stew, clutching decapitated heads. Not only is the Nawa cosmos cooked up, but cooking, birthing, not to mention death, and war are all sacrificial acts of creation. Okay. Several folios along, at mid-center top, we find Quetzalcoatl extracting the heart of the first human offering. He feeds its sacrificial blood to his brother Tezcatlipoca. Below, center left, the underworld crocodile, or Cipactli, swallows the decapitated offering into its belly, wherein he meets the Lord of Death, Mictlantecutli. Then center right, the human offering battles a team of underworld players in a ball game, loses and is killed yet again. Bottom right, we see the old creator couple, first human's parents, sitting in their watery residence. His mother, Oshimoko, holds a bunch of corn, while his father, Cipactonal, releases a conch shell out of which pops a little god called a Makwiltoneki, brandishing a weapon of lightning. Bottom center, in a final sacrifice, the now skeletonized offering yields 6 animals and 5 gods, the Makwiltoneki. Finally, bottom left, a Makwiltoneki stews in another anthropomorphized pot, boiling over a fire. Then above him, 2 different forms of Quetzalcoatl eat from a bowl containing corn-colored food, and the cooked Makwiltoneki. Not only is the cosmos initially birthed from a living cooking pot, and not only do cooking, birthing, and warring equal sacrificial acts, but also water sacrificially produces the world's food, and eating itself is a sacrificial act. Well, what can we make of all this? I see weird faces. This always happens at this point, by the way. Besides the weirdly multiple deaths of the human sacrifice, why are deities eating each other? Is death really death, as we generally understand it? How can death and killing be related to birth? What import for creation do bones hold?
And is everyone in this world doomed to cannibalism? Moreover, I warn you, as weird as this stuff may seem at first glance, it's probably going to get weirder. So why bother studying this strange, frankly gross-out Aztecs? Especially with some cockamamie idea that we might learn something useful from them. This brings us to a topic I always have to address when discussing the Nahua. How helpful are our common misperceptions of these very complicated, very strangely foreign peoples? Frankly, not too much. Ever since Cortez marched into Cholula, the Borgia's possible hometown, and over the hills to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, one might think that almost everyone, from the 16th-century Spanish to Mel Gibson, thinks Aztec sacrifice demonstrates just what evil, power-hungry, theocratic, urbanite, nasty savages they really were. But also, beginning with the first Spanish, a bit less often perhaps, the opposite appears, offering pictures of wise and morally good, noble savages. Often countryside village dwellers, though not always, who live in perfect harmony with each other and nature. It's been my unfortunate experience that when faced with a basic lack of knowledge about the Aztecs, we almost automatically imagine them first as nasty theocrats. And if not that, we quickly overcompensate, my own personal tendency, by flipping into ideas about spiritual, mystical people in tune with the stars and nature. I'm not saying that some of that isn't at least partly untargeted, for it is. But neither the noble nor nasty images come even close to a fuller, more complex, far more interesting, and therefore more helpful picture. Even Mel Gibson thought Mesoamericans worthy of consideration in terms of our own problems. You may remember he begins the movie with a quote from Will Durant, "A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within." Gibson saw apocalypto as a morality tale, a warning to us all about what may happen if we don't shape up. Okay. The problem is that, in the words of Stefan Lofgren, apocalypto tortures the facts. For one, and we'll ignore innumerable smaller gaffes, Gibson conflated the decline of the late classic Maya centers, which occurred anywhere from the 700s to around 900 AD, depending on the place, with the Aztecs, who lived at minimum 3 to 4 centuries later, and, to my amazement, he had Columbus floating in 500 years earlier than he really did. This is a bit like conflating the medieval period with the 20th century and dropping the 9/11 attacks into the London of 1501. Okay, that historically minor issue aside, I actually agree with Gibson that we ought to take people like the Mesoamericans seriously, but not for the same reasons, and I fondly hope not in the same way. Okay. Yeah, we're good. So why bother with the Aztecs if we are concerned with ecological issues? Well, if we can at minimum temper some of our misperceptions, we'll never be free of all of them. The Aztecs become a little more human and therefore more like us, which allows us to just maybe accept that like us, they may perhaps did some intelligent things that might prove helpful, and like us, they perhaps made a few mistakes from which we could possibly learn. I suspect that we can find some granted very broad comparisons that might make us seem a little closer to the Nahua than we may actually like. For as two advanced societies, they were advanced, within our respective historical contexts, we both, in our own distinctive ways, live in a highly complex, closely packed urban centers with hinterlands devoted to food production, among lots of other things, are pretty darn violent and warlike, both symbolically and in action, whether we like to admit that or not, value birth, life, fruition, and distrust extremism, or at least we both say we do, want to support our own people, however we define that, and struggle with severely stressed resources in spite of very efficient production methods. There are some extremely interesting differences as well which I find particularly intriguing, especially since differences often offer us our biggest challenges, those forcing us to reconsider our own comfort zones. A good thing in my book. More specifically, I am most interested in exploring what I am calling ecological ontology, and given the comparative nature of my work and what I see as social parallels, however broad, I wish to explore Nawa ideas to raise challenging issues worth considering in light of our own ontological views. Okay. So, is it possible to find some ecologically oriented ontological ideas that could challenge a comfortable concept or two, fueling our current deeply serious and multifaceted environmental crises? Now, just so you don't think I'm totally crazy, I'm not alone in this. Environmental authors like Timothy Morton and Patty Woodward are also interested in probing indigenous environmental ideas. Hey, the Aztecs were definitely indigenous, and at least on some superficial levels, they were way more like us than some other possible indigenous contexts. So why not? Thus, I intend to A, explore the Aztec ecologically relational and sacrificially cooked cosmos in order to B, compare it to some of our own seemingly cosmically rooted paradigms, which may be worth challenging, challenges which could use C, some ideas offered by the Aztecs for our consideration in light of our current widespread environmental problems. However, warning, my purpose today is not so much to solve all problems, which is absolutely impossible, but simply to raise a few critical questions and offer a few potentially creative possibilities. In other words, I'm hoping to do no more than try out a newish sort of recipe or two. Okay, next. And I just drank a bunch of coffee. And no, this is not gin. Cooking up a cosmic meal Nawa style. According to Elizabeth Boone, the Borgia came from the Tlaxcala, Mixteca, Puebla region, just to the south-southeast over the mountains from Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City, the highly populated capital of the huge Mexican domain. This vibrant region contained numerous urban centers wherein Nawa, Mixtec, and many other peoples participated actively in economic and ideological exchanges. Boone suggests that the Codex actually may hail from Cholula, a religious center and pilgrimage site with close sites to the Mexica, as well as other locations. The document itself shows some Mixtec characteristics, but is more closely related to Nawa religious expressions. The screen fold, or accordion-like manuscript, was meant to be set on a hard surface and read from right to left on one side, continuing around to the reverse side. A trained professional called a daykeeper would have dramatically presented its information, sometimes chanting the story from memory, and other times using his divinatory almanacs to help his clients with many daily needs. By sheer luck, these ancient pictures have been preserved, and although the Borgia's daykeepers are now dead, similar living practitioners are active elsewhere in Mesoamerica. Boone has argued persuasively that Borgia's 18-page sequence presents, among other things, a complex cosmogonic tale, something unusual, for no other almanac of this type contains anything quite like it. The cosmogony appears to begin with the creation of not with the creation of the entire cosmos, but with the fifth and current age of 5 great ages called suns, which were common to Mexican highland traditions. We see how life originated for 15th-century folk using the document. Much ritual appears in these pages, and while that certainly marks the fundamental importance of ritual sacrifice in the Borgia's world, it does not override its basic cosmogonic thrust. Indeed, our 3 interlocking themes of Nawa ecological ontology repeatedly appear in the cosmogonic folios: cooking, feeding, and eating, birthing and warring, and right sacrificial, ecologically rooted relationships. A story recorded in Nawa might shed light on these themes. This story describes how, as part of the preparation for the 5th sun, Quetzalcoatl carried human bones he had stolen from the underworld's Lord of Death to Kilasli, a goddess in Camoanchan. She then ground them like corn, and he bled his penis on the flour, so that the first humans could be formed for the dough. The story ends with Quetzalcoatl and other creator deities declaring together, "The gods and commoners were born because they gave us merit." To explain a bit, merit, or masewa, describes the nature of particular powers called teoyomi, flowing through almost all things. These powers are specific to an object, human or otherwise, giving it life and allowing it to exert certain pressures that influence others and shape events. Several things can be suggested by this passage. First, the fifth son's gods and commoners were formed simultaneously from this fertile act of bloodletting. Second, this happened because sacrificial bloodletting gave the original creators powers. Third, human merit resides in the edible bones and blood from which they were shaped. Fourth, since humans and gods were born from these freely offered corn-like bones and semen-like blood, their own food-like merit has incurred a debt that must be paid back. Indeed, the Nahua word neshplawalishti means a payment of debt and refers to similar sacrificial offerings. While not pictured with the exact same details, this story still can help add depth to sacrifice's meaning. Here lies the suggestion that blood from penises, as in picture number 1, upper right, yes, they're poking their little wee ears, creates humans and gods out of that which nourishes them. Follow the blood up. The two people at the top are eating it. Moreover, sacrificial blood is and begets nourishment, both pictures 1 and 2. People and gods cook and feed each other out of debt for their own mutual existence. Just as gods nourished each other, so too is the merit of all humans. Quetzalcoatl and the first human fed their semen-like blood to that human's parents before the human's own sacrifice yielded both animals and more deities, picture 3, who then were cooked and fed back to Quetzalcoatl, picture 4. If we are to, in other words, sacrifice was an obligatory exchange of nourishment, a debt that, when paid, provided sustenance to make things happen. If we are to eat, we must be willing to be eaten by others. But there's more to this set of relationships than just eating. Expanding on this theme of commensurable debt payment, a complex set of imagery links the underworld, corn, crossroads, gestation, cooking, childbearing, and war. First, reading from right to left, they didn't read like we do, reading from right to left, the creator couple, Sipactonal and Oshomoko, both wear the helmets of the underworld crocodile. Oshomoko holds corn, while Sipactonal releases a lightning-wielding solar deity. Second, through a series of sacrificial transformations, the first human sacrifice is reduced to his bones at the crossroads, considered an ash heap, at the center of the 4 cosmic directions, equated with 5 little gods who are related to that first guy with his lightning. Third, the fifth and central little solar deity, the first one who popped out, is stewed in an ash pot, the vessel in which corn was soaked in lime before food preparation. Finally, Quetzalcoatl eats from a bowl containing that solar deity in corn-colored food. The successive sacrificial decomposing of bones at the center of the cosmos produce corn that is likewise decomposed in ashes before being cooked and consumed. To further expand on this theme of decomposition, we're talking ecologically here, so we got to do decomposition. Corn was stored in mountains whose caves provided access to the watery underworld. These pot-shaped storehouses held the seeds where they acquired their hearts or particular powers to sprout and grow through a process of decomposition. So too, like crossroads and mountain hearts, an expectant mother's womb was called an ash pot, where her seedling baby, decomposed, in order to acquire its heart or destined characteristics. The newborn's umbilical cord was cut over an ear of maize before its washing of filth, just as lime-soaked corn was washed. Moreover, the warrior Quetzalcoatl, who stole the first corn seeds from the mountain of sustenance, also gifted this child. Decomposition helped shape various beings' characters from corn to babies. While birth itself was called the mother's moment of death, a theme echoed by 3 skeletal figures in the very first scene, once the baby was safely born, the new mother became the goddess Quetzalcoatl, the woman warrior who shaped the first humans from corn. By repeating the acts of those who treated the first age, pregnancy became a cooking process, at the end of which a battle occurred. And if successfully concluded, the woman warrior victoriously claimed her well-prepared corn, the baby. Pots and bowls were where sacrificed, decomposed things were prepared before they emerged as edible foodstuff, ready for sacrificial transformations, each considered a death payment. War was one of the ways food was captured. In the final cosmogonic scene, Quetzalcoatl cooks in yet another ash pot, preparing for his final performance, the lighting of the first new fire in the heart cavity of Xochiquetzal, goddess of flowers. Earlier, a bat had poured flowering blood from a sacrificial heart over Xochiquetzal, who then produced a flowering tree in whose branches a Quetzalcoatl hummingbird hovered, perhaps ready to suck the nectar. These final images present another complex set of relationships. First, flowers often served as a metaphor for sustenance, probably because edible plants produce flowers. Yet second, flowers also were a frequent metaphor for war, aggressions aimed at capturing sacrificial offerings. The open of a poem from Chalco begins with women warriors, not yet pregnant, seeking flowers from the earth's 4 directions. The poem, which was performed for the Mexica ruling ward of the entire region, metaphorically links flowers, war, sex, and poetic song in order to send a rather thinly veiled Chalcan threat to the Mexica. War netted sacrifices whose worth was in their fertile blood, which fed and sustained the living civic bodies, perhaps helping them blossom. Once the new fire was lit, the 5th son was born, and the ritual continued to birth it again every 52 years. The age itself, a living being, was doomed to destruction in 676 years. Okay, told you it was going to get weirder. In the Borgia's cosmogony, all kinds of things appear to be living and therefore hungry. Almost everything seems personified with eyes, mouths, and teeth, always teeth. Many come with legs and arms, sometimes ending in claws, sometimes hands and feet. The list is long, including deities, humans, animals, plants, trees, knives, vessels, winds, calendrical dates, the stars above and the earth underfoot. If there is any sense of something being totally inanimate, we do not find it easily here. An overwhelming number of pictures depict animate beings existing in ritually proscribed relationships that ensure nourishment for all. To eat and be eaten is simply the way the entire world reproduces itself. In other words, death payments or sacrifices destructively kill, decompose, cook, eat, creatively transform, birth, and produce all living beings. Which brings me to the issue of the environments of those living beings. Even though much of the land in Mesoamerica showed clear signs of human impact, the 16th century Spaniards dubbed Mesoamerica wilderness, thereby hiding the historically long and deeply sophisticated pre-Columbian agricultural practices, both from themselves and later investigators. This was due partly to their view that the New World was untamed and God-given for use, for human use, especially theirs. Future generations of scholars, often relying on incomplete or misinformed Spanish documentation, also failed to find sophisticated techniques. Fortunately, a recent generation of researchers have been correcting these misperceptions now. Took a while. Sweden is one such example of sophisticated Mesoamerican agricultural practices. This complex rotational system has been used for centuries. A plot is cleared, burned, planted, harvested for some years, then allowed to lie fallow until needed again. Sweden was and still is extremely efficient. From current practices, we know that annual burning would have enriched the pre-Conquest soils for planting, while fallowing would have provided habitat for medicinal and useful wild plants, games, building materials, and an acceleration of the forest recovery. Humans were involved at every stage, fertilizing fields, picking which plants to encourage a weed, cutting trees, clearing and pruning. Home gardens were equally managed. Both local and exotic species were selected for their usefulness, others weeded out. All were multi-cropped and fertilized with ashes, kitchen waste, and human excrement. Equally efficient activities adapted wetland areas to human use. Raised fields, or chinampas, were an historically ancient permanent irrigation system used extensively in the Mexican highlands and elsewhere. The Mexica, whose capital Tenochtitlan housed up to 300,000 people, reclaimed wetlands by constructing raised mounds, dredging up rich soil from the lake's bottom, and spreading the usual fertilizers, including human waste, refreshed these mounds. 7 crops could be rotated through these mounds annually if conditions permitted, and multi-cropping minimized their risks should the weather not cooperate. Chinampas also included fish hatcheries and habitats rich in birds and animals, and a huge range of insects and reptiles Westerners would not consider food, but Mesoamericans did. The fertilizer feeding the fields served a critical purpose in Mesoamerican life. Thus, as a sign of impending war, the Borgia's Quetzalcoatl Venus, left center here, excreted Dawn's bloody fertilizer. If you watch where that stuff is coming out, and it's got flowers on it, it's flowering, the sun surely needed a good breakfast before its strenuous skyward climb. Moreover, like corn, neonatal babies grew in a container of fertilizing ashes, and the rotting, filthy underworld muck from lake bottoms fed chinampa fields. Decomposing, smelling, disgusting, dying stuff sustained the living. Sacrifice envisioned this rotten eating. It was simply how the world's beings connected to one another. In other words, all beings in this ecological cosmos lived in the same debt-paying relationships as did the beings in their fields and waterways. Environmental archaeologist David Letts offers a potentially useful model for understanding the Borgia's ecological cosmological relationships. He defines an anthropocentric trophic or food web as a set of populations whose interactions are intensely linked and act as a subunit of a larger ecological community with loose connections to other subunits. These webs include humans, their biggest consumers, domesticated and wild animals and plants, and a vast host of other organisms, often living in symbiotic relationships. Both Sweden and Chinampa systems exemplify managed trophic webs, and their human managers were well aware of what fed what, if not on the microscopic level, certainly at an experiential level. However, no trophic web stays in perfect balance. According to Lentz, ecological stability remains only as long as outside influences do not disturb it. But because outside influences are almost constant, ecological communities are in constant flux. In a steady state of what he calls imperfect balance, ecological communities stay balanced a while, but never forever. From a human standpoint, our environments change, always have, and always will. We all live in a state of imperfect balance. The Navajo were well aware that maintaining perfect balance was impossible. Biologically and cosmologically, nothing stayed the same. After its 4 preceding ages died and transformed into the next, the 5th sun, named movement, would die by earthquakes. which, by the way, were considered birth pains. Nothing was born without smashing, killing, grinding, or reshaping something else. Alfredo Lopez Austin describes their whole cosmos as a recycling process, replicating agricultural production. Thus, human and all other seeds are sown inside underground pots. Decomposition both nurtures and shapes them, transforming them into plant-like beings who, after sacrificial eating, return to the underground to be transformed again and again through repeated sacrificial cycles. All beings in the Borgia's cosmos lived in the same sacrificial, debt-paying relationships as the beings in their fields and waterways. All right, before I draw out the picture here. I have a fan, you guys don't, so you guys are being very noble. Okay, cooking the cosmos. Comparing Aztec to Western modernist cosmic cuisines and some challenging possibilities. The Aztec cosmos was fully materialized, and to exist materially meant to live. Even time had a living form. Remember, what we call an age, which we trace with numbers, but never envision as an actual, not metaphoric, person, now our peoples did see as a real person named sun. Moreover, their complex, sophisticated calendrical system was counted by coordinating numbers laid out according to the 4 solar directions, with both earthly objects like temples and mountains and actual persons traveling through the sky. Just as it is hard to find anything inanimate, something not living, some non-being in the Nawa world, it is equally hard to find something that is not materially imagined. This biological cosmos consisted of innumerable biological forms, all closely interconnected through right relationships shaped by that debt-paying sacrificial exchange. Thus, if the term had even existed, ecological relationships would have meant far more than simply what happened in their fields and wetlands. It would have referred to the whole blessed universe. In his book, The Ecological Thought, Timothy Morton has called this kind of worldview the mesh, an ever-shifting, interconnected entanglement of everything from atoms and the tiniest organisms to the planets and galaxies far, far away. Even thought itself is ecological, materially enmeshed with everything else. Martin is one of a number of environmentally concerned thinkers who are exploring what it means to live in a fully materialized world of interconnected objects. A world seemingly more similar to Aztec thinking than some of our old familiar Western concepts. These authors, called variously object-oriented ontologists, speculative realists, or material religionists, that's a handful, argue that we need to radically think some of our long-standing worldviews if we are to reconceive our relationships with what we call nature, especially when it is mistakenly distinguished from humans. Indeed, these scholars argue that we need to dump our historical tendency to think dialectically, as when we pit nature versus culture, plants and or animals versus humans, physical versus non-physical, living versus non-living, or even physical versus the imaginary. For Graham Harman, for example, diamonds, ropes, monsters, square circles, leagues of real and imaginations, dragons, etc., all count as objects. Bruno Latour claims that when faced with ecological threats, the animate versus inanimate opposition turns us impotent because it creates 2 divided domains, one that is inanimate and has no agency, and one that is animate and concentrates all agency. In fact, Martin calls for an upgraded version of animism that treats people as beings without aggrandizing nature with a capital N. But he adds this isn't just another belief system. That implies something about living rather than non-living things. Instead, as he says, the uncanny truth is that we're all the same. Indeed, the very existence of environment as a word points out that we have to point it out. And ecology, as a word, runs the risk of becoming another kind of superbeing outside of the mesh, outside the obvious impermanence and evanescence of reality. Morton's uncentered and borderless ecological thought, which he calls ET, regards beings as people even when they aren't. So what would happen if we tried to cook our cosmic books? By focusing only on material objects, physical and imaginary, blotting out the unseen, unformed, and eternal, could we create a new recipe for our relationships with what we call nature? If we try to conceive a world of natural relationships, not only in a scientific sense, but also in a philosophic, religious sense, could we picture a world that did not prioritize anything beyond objects? And could we perhaps do this without assigning a hierarchy of importance to some things over others by just recognizing that the world is made up of a gazillion or more objects, including ourselves, each with its own strange character and agency, all connected and in a constant state of flux? If we thought this way, what would be our ecological, ontological relationships with nature? The object-oriented thinkers who are already trying to do this actually end up sounding a lot like the Aztec ecological and ontology we've been exploring. So what can we learn from the Aztecs? Well, for one, we can learn that we too are enmeshed within trophic webs. We too have to violently kill, weed, thin, cut, chop, and spread dead, mucky, rotting, disgusting, smelling stuff in order to produce food. Hey, I was a home gardener. That carrot you just chomped down with your gnashing teeth was produced by killing other baby carrots in order to thin the plot. It fed on detritus of decaying plants, food and manure, and was chopped, boiled, or zapped in a microwave before you even opened your mouth to bite. We too have 1 trillion microbes in our own gut. Some just sit there, some cause disease, sometimes only when misplaced, but otherwise are benign or even helpful. Some we couldn't live without because they help digest our food. Our own bodies are imperfectly balanced trophic webs in which a gazillion creatures, including ourselves, eat and feed, use and sustain each other in a state of pretty much constant change. We too unavoidably make sacrifices or debt payments, sustain, feed and nourish, all living beings, birth and produce, transform, birth and produce, sustain, feed and nourish all living beings in our webs. You heard this already, so it should be familiar. Okay. But this trophic web eating thing raises 3 challenging, ecologically rooted questions about debt-paying sacrificial relationships. First, what would it be like if our cosmos were composed of only objects, potentially all of which we conceive as living beings? Well, we might have to love our E. coli. We would need to embrace them because they're as important to us as the carrot they transform into vitamin K2 in our lower intestines. And they protect us from other microbes. However, we also would have to recognize that when E. coli gets into our poop, they can turn it bloody while still sustaining other beings than ourselves, and that these strange alien gut beings are intimate pieces of ourselves, no less natural or weirdly scary than a Nawa mythical beast. In the end, we might have questions about where and if we could draw clear boundaries separating us from them. For we both need each other. Like the Nawa, we would be living in a materialized world that questions the arbitrary boundaries drawn between us and the countless, often seriously strange others, so necessary to all existence. Second, since everything eats and feeds everything else, what would our debt-paying relationships be like? All creativity requires destroying something to create something new, whether physical or metaphorical. Therefore, we can't avoid all violence. The very act of eating is doing violence to somebody else, like killing the carrot bean. And change itself is a form of comestible, creative, destructive debt payment that can be as easily inescapable and unpleasant as any desired pleasant transformation. A major question now presents itself. Everyone must sacrificially eat someone else, but who, when, why, and how? Third, what would it be like to be eaten? When is cooking an acceptable sacrifice, and when is it murder or even cannibalism? The Nawa cosmos is seamlessly interconnected in a sacrificial social order. All beings, all living objects, feed on others and feed themselves to others to pay back their debts. What forms would our own debt payments take? For we cannot avoid the fact that we too are enmeshed in trophic webs of life and death. How would we reconcile our individual freedoms with our cosmic social needs? What responsibilities do we have for the gazillion others like the E. coli in our cosmos? When would we be willing to radically transform ourselves so much that we become someone quite different? When and how are we willing to be eaten in order to sustain others? But how can we draw boundaries in this borderless, imperfectly balanced, constantly changing cosmos in which everything eats each other? Levi Bryant offers the vision of a non-hierarchical, flat ontology which through its egalitarianism refuses to erase any object as a mere construction of another object. Yet, even Bryant doesn't claim all objects contribute equally, just that they all equally exist. This means that the really hard question, when we cook our boots, is what do we hide and what do we highlight? Because that is what happens when you cook the books. Hiding and highlighting fundamentally are issues of boundary marking, deciding to where to put the borders between that which you want noticed and that which you do not. A cosmic book based on oppositional clarity may be comforting to some. However, as the object-oriented authors are pointing out, that presents a false picture of our natural relationships that cannot deal with our environmental challenges. For one, unlike the Aztec cosmic book, our current one hides the necessary violence that happens when everybody eats everybody else by highlighting some eating is good, like beans, which have no eyes and we think can't feel pain, and others is bad, like cows, which do and obviously can. We share some dirty secrets, though. We both, the Aztecs and we, hide our warlike tendencies. The Aztecs behind war's noble necessity and admonishments to everybody, including rulers, to behave with moderation. While we also highlight its noble necessity, we do so with rhetoric about our democratic, peace-loving society. So here's the really hard question. Does either highlighting or hiding control violence or just encourage more unnecessary violence? This is an old anthropological question, by the way, guys. Okay, last one. But is our goose already cooked? Even if we could answer these hard questions, and I'm not sure I can, is our goose cooked already anyway? Environmentalists are deeply worried that we are rapidly approaching, or possibly have already passed, major tipping points when ecosystem functions degrade so much the changes become irreversible. Yet we are caught between a rock and a hard place. Ecological problems are so complex that we cannot be fully confident that we know exactly what will fix them, even in small-scale projects, much less threats as huge as climate change. Then again, I personally worry about whether we can change our viewpoints and alter our direction fast enough. Culture itself is a magnificently slow living beast to change. Our worldviews are great books that have been cooked for centuries, highly resistant to internal regulators, no matter how important. Finally, some are now asking, why even bother? The mesh doesn't give a hoot whether we silly humans live or die, so let's just enjoy what we have while we have it. For my part, I answer that with, why not? I have grandchildren who will have children someday, and I don't enjoy being the cause of future pain to them or anyone else. So I'm with Patty Woodward on this. I would rather move from denial and despair to hope. After all, that book is a living beast. We need to keep our eyes wide open, though. I have no urge to increase our violence simply by recognizing it, or make poor ecological decisions by denying the violence necessary for the job. We have made some progress. We just need to move a little quicker. Okay, I admit that last bit sounds a little lame, but got a better idea? There's a bunch of us, me included, and there are more than ready to listen. And with that,
Thank you. So, questions?
I assume I poked somebody here.
Yeah, well, okay, so.
I always poke somebody with this.
Yeah, couple of things. One is that a lot of what you said reminded me of Indian and Upanishadic texts, actually, the emphasis on the food and the eater of food and cooking and so forth.
Yes, I studied with Wendy O'Flaherty.
Yeah, but that's a side issue. The main issue is that I confess to not understanding what the object-oriented thinkers are up to. I've read a lot of Latour, but I haven't read a whole lot of speculative realism. I'm a little worried about the idea of throwing the dumpling out with the cooking water in thinking that we can and should get rid of dialectical thinking. I really don't fully understand how that advances any prospect of accounting for reality. And I was wondering if you'd say more. I mean, clearly, specious binaries are not very useful. It's useful, but sometimes recognizing their limitations and watching the friction that develop in trying to think our way through those binaries and see their problems produces a certain amount of light, right? Friction can produce heat, but it can also produce light. I like thinking dialectically. I don't want to give it up, and I think that giving it up is actually itself a problem. We acquire this at a great deal of pain to ourselves, and I think that sort of hand-waving in the direction of it's not working does it a disservice. I was wondering if you could say that about that.
I would agree for the most part, based on the idea that we're not going to solve these problems unless we all come from our own backgrounds and find what we can find to rework our thinking in a way that is more productive. Most of the object-oriented ontologists, the OO people, that's what they call themselves, that OO, have an in for dialectic thinking, okay? And there's all kinds of dialectical thinking. And I think the problem that is raised with it has also been raised in our culture when we went through all those social, and still are going through these social upheavals with black versus white and male versus female and primitive versus, civilized, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of these things in which if you maintain the dialectic, you may be in a state of friction, but recognizing that blacks are humans like whites in particular ways becomes difficult. Okay, and I think they feel similarly that if you separate some of this out too much, then yes, the friction can be certainly really creative, but you may not recognize, you may have some false boundaries that don't recognize how closely everybody's interconnected. And that's what they're afraid of. So, I mean, we're back to the question of where do you want to, Latour's problem is he doesn't draw enough boundaries. I think we're stuck with boundaries. We have to decide what we want to decide. But my point is we need to be really conscious about what we're doing and not just declare, I don't like that.
Sure, right. Yeah, I have no problem with that. It's just black versus white. Immediately in talking about that, right, you spell out the worry about privileging one human over another, which immediately brings in another dialectical category of human versus non-human. And I feel like, right? And so, and we can sort of stack this out or move out as far as we want to go in this, but the question about whether we should love our E. coli is an easy thing to solve. The question of whether we should love our Ebola is not.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, we just have the E. coli more under control.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that there were infectious large infectious things with E. coli as well. The Aztecs probably suffered with it because they were using human waste in their fields,
Yeah.
on their food. That's what you can get if you do that, okay? Ebola is new, E. coli is old. In many ways I'm going to respond because my youngest son is actually a Brazilianist and he works on medical issues and, rampaging infectious events are what he works on. So all of a sudden he's getting asked to talk all over the place because, oh boy, Ebola. He says he hates to say it, but it's helping him out. His point would be is that we're repeating what's happened in history on that. And we need to be aware of that and think it through. We do need to make boundaries. I myself tend to try to work in what I call them as a messy middle. So let's not get too extreme over here,
Right.
and let's not get too extreme over here, but deal with the mess as it is here, between those ranges.
You sound like a Buddhist.
Yeah, well, I'm not, but I've studied enough of it, and I actually like a fair portion of it.
Thank you.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, I wasn't sure, to go back to the boundary issue, I wasn't sure how or if you were drawing the boundary. And one of Ken Wilber's critique of deep ecology is precisely on that issue.
Yeah.
Deep ecology doesn't draw boundaries and create, therefore, hierarchies, because often boundaries create hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
And he finally goes back to Aristotle's chain of being, which is a kind of interesting move for someone like Ken Wilber to make in doing that. Arnie Nass's whole insight that led to his deep ecological expressions was based on the experience of watching a flea die under a microscope. So there's kind of boundary issues in all that. I was curious what you were making then. Are there boundaries? Aren't there boundaries? Are boundaries useful? What were you finally saying?
I don't think we can get rid of boundaries, otherwise we end up in la-la land and we have to work.
And then, so how does one then establish a boundary?
I'm not sure. That is, for me at this point, the issue. How do we establish those boundaries?
And in some of this, it's there in warfare. Is it okay to kill these people or not these people?
Oh, that's a
It's
good
there in
question.
our daily diets. Is it
Yeah.
okay to eat these biological beings and not these? So, we all make those decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously.
Oh,
So
yes.
I guess, what does this then suggest about the process if we want to do that more consciously?
Well, we have to be, first of all, conscious about the boundaries. One of the problems with environmental stuff is that it's hard to get people worried about whether you're killing a carrot. Okay, it's okay to kill carrots. Now, if you do damage to an animal because we relate to it better, that's horrible, okay? So that's a boundary that's been drawn, and I'm fine. We need our diverse viewpoints on this and figure out ways to work at this from many different positions, because we ain't ever going to agree on one thing. For my purposes, it's still a somewhat arbitrary boundary. So on some level, you have to recognize that it's arbitrary, but I'm doing it for now because it's working. Either from an ecological standpoint or environmental standpoint, or because of your own religious, philosophical, social, whatever tradition, it feels like you can think this way.
So working means cognitive functionality?
Oh God, what goes on in the brains? What do you mean working? Cognitive functionality? No, that's too simple, because you keep changing, even in the brain. And there's this, we were discussing this, with our dodo understanding of what goes on with neurology, little pathways that get
But I
forced.
guess I'm meaning simply by that it makes sense to me, so that's understood.
Yeah,
But then that.
but you may have pathways that have been formed culturally that you feel comfortable with, experientially that you feel comfortable with. And if you can make sense out of things, then that's good. I'm never going to be a vegan because, quite frankly, I can't be. I don't know if you remember, but I have this notorious life-threatening death to all nuts and peanuts, and I have to watch it on how many beans I eat. So, I better eat meat because I ain't going to be very healthy. So, for one person, that may be the right decision. but for another person, it isn't. Still, we need to understand what we're doing when we do that, and how that is not just an individual decision, and how that decision works into this huge network of all kinds of stuff. I mean, I think people tend to often just sort of emotionally react. Yeah, Lisa.
I want to ask about reality. Your last.
Oh God, that's a loaded word.
This is a word I've been thinking a lot about.
You should be.
I guess maybe I'm not sure what the solution is that you're leaving us with that we're supposed to argue.
I am not
with,
leaving
so-
you with a solution.
Well,
I warned you in the beginning I wouldn't.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in your middle box, you were talking about the complexity of nature, so, you don't understand it very
Yeah,
well, right? So
yeah.
we can't be sure that our solutions will work, and especially on a global scale, that's almost
Right.
impossible. But I think you're saying that we kind of hope that we've understood reality well enough that we can believe that the changes we're making, even if they're incremental, are going to make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, you
Because
can't
there's
not
this
act.
tension between those two things.
I don't think, well, we have a choice to do whatever we want, but I don't think that's a very good choice at all, to not act. I mean, I think we know enough to know that we're gonna be in
That's
very deep doo-doo if we don't act, metaphorically speaking.
we know enough.
We know enough. Now, as restorationists point out, you can get into a small-scale restoration project and what you thought you knew suddenly goes out the window, and you have to rework things. So, I mean, I think you have to start from that position. We think we know enough to do something, so we need to do it.
I guess I wouldn't call that reality.
No, well, it depends on how you're defining reality. Is reality ever changing, or is reality, a truth with a capital T that never alters? Yeah, it's a loaded word. I don't buy the truth with a capital T, I buy the changing idea. That we have kind of positions we're standing on, at least temporarily, that we can work with in our imperfectly balanced, world. But when things change, we better be ready to recognize the change and then work with it somehow. Does that make
If I
sense?
can say one other thing, think
Yeah.
about the question about what we eat. It seems to me now we're understanding it's not whether we eat meat or plants, but how we grow those things, right?
Oh, yeah, that I didn't
So,
even want to get into.
The Aztecs didn't have that problem.
No,
Because
they
everything
didn't.
was local. and it was
Everything was
organic.
local, but that didn't support 300,000 very well. So, that's why, in some ways, they're a good example because, yeah, they had really successful, local, sustainable practices, as long as you didn't throw 300,000 on the same island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. And that is a repeated failure all the way from the Mayan up. As the population outstrips the environment, then it's not the only reason for collapse. Collapse is always multi-causal, but it is often one of the causes. And we could surely learn something from that we can go for sustainable local, but will that support Chicago? Probably not. So we need to think elsewhere on that.
That's why I don't
What?
do it. That's why I don't do it.
So you're just gonna write them off. You're gonna write Chicago off, thank you. Erin.
So I gave us a lot to read in Dr. Sullivan's class, and there
When
was
she told you you didn't have to read it.
and I did.
Oh, you good student, you.
So we were discussing debt, and I was trying to grapple with the other article about guilt and shame.
Mhm.
And guilt and shame seem
This is
to work
working.
really well. And when you start talking about debt, you didn't really touch upon
No.
if the debt was something they hoped for and then wanted to fulfill, or if it was something they were trying to avoid.
It depends on the circumstance and the kind of sacrifice.
Okay.
The ones Hollywood deal with, the wars, those warriors knew what they were getting into. And they would be caught and
in the Flowery Wars anyway, or else it would just be all-out war, just like we know it is, where they go after each other and hope somebody lands on top. But the ritualized ones were Flowery Wars. Actually, they often preceded the all-out ones, where they call each other a lot of names, met on the same, agreed ahead of time to meet on the same battlefield, kind of like ball game, went after each other with the idea that they were going to capture as many people from the other side as they could and bring back to sacrifice. I would imagine those guys didn't want to. I didn't know, but they knew what they were getting into, right?
Well, I guess I mean, I'm not trying to create a solution, but when you suggest debt for myself, I mean, that means I have repayment, at least in my own thought
Right.
process. And
Yes.
so if I have this guilt or shame, whichever, I mean, I guess more would say guilt, should I be doing something with that? Should I be showing more guilt through debt repayment and talking about it? I mean,
Probably, but,
probably, okay.
yeah, because, even the first tortilla of the day was a sacrifice. Okay, so you do that willingly, that's not chopping anybody's heads out or decapitating them or whatever. And most of the debt payment was done with bloodletting and those kinds of rituals, killing food that they were going to eat. One of the reasons was from William Jordan, and I only used him. He's an environmental scientist who's known as one of the very earliest people to, actually he's credited with kind of inventing the word, I think, of restoration. I know Bill really well. Bill's a good Catholic. And he's open about it, I gotta say that. He is well educated and he's an environmentalist, biologically trained environmentalist, who had retired early so he could start philosophically thinking about this. Now I give him a hard time because he wants to create sacrificial rituals that would deal with the shame of having to kill to eat. Now he's defining shame in a very narrow way, which is why we all keep dumping on him, because shame can be understood in a whole lot of ways. For him, shame is not being able to change what you wish you could change, but can't, okay? And that is one definition of shame. So he is using that as we can't change this reality, such as it is and what we know of it. I don't know another word. I know it's problematic.
Well, just don't capitalize it.
Well, that's because I want people to see, it's in red and capitalized so you can read it easy on the screen. That's a layout issue. No, normally I don't capitalize it. That's his idea. Now, I don't know if that'll be successful. Creating rituals is, those of us in religious studies know you don't just go out and create a ritual, right? Ritual's got to grow up. I mean, that whole thing is kind of goofy. It works about as well as creating a cosmology you want everybody to believe. Not very well, which is what you were writing about. We've hacked, in the group, hacked back and forth. He's one of the founders of the Institute. Hacked back and forth on how to do this, and I don't know that he's solved it. He's now into a new book on othering because he's convinced, and he may have a point on this, that, actually a big point, that we feel uncomfortable with a lot of this stuff because we other things like carrots and plants and beans, which is why the us and them dialectic is not a helpful one. I mean, you could choose your dialectics here, whatever. But anyway, he wants to start exploring othering because he thinks we other nature. And as long as we other it, it's not like us. We're not part of it. And we have to get past that somehow.
So I think it's been very warm in here.
Maybe I have a fan.
Maybe we should take this out in the hall. There's some refreshments out there.
Is it cooler out there?
It's cooler out there. Thank you very much.
They don't have. Yeah. It's warm.
Gail should, yeah. So did you guys understand a lot of that? That's kind of what I was doing.
It was a good session.
Say something like that?
I mean, I don't live in
Right.
Every, I mean, we talk about things as a life cycle,
That's
but
nice.
so specifically everything consuming or decaying.
That's nice light. She's sitting there.